only been a couple years ago that some of you joined with me to study Reuben Jobe's little book titled Three Simple Rules of Wesleyan Way of Living. In that book, he said this, and I quote, "Each of us knows groups that are locked in conflict, sometimes over profound issues, and sometimes issues that are just plain silly. The conflict is real, the division is deep, and the consequences can be devastating. If, however, all who are involved agree to do no harm, the climate in which the conflict is going on is immediately changed." How is it changed, he says? Well, if I am to do no harm, I can no longer gossip about the conflict. I can no longer speak disparagingly about those involved in the conflict. I can no longer manipulate the facts of the conflict. I can no longer diminish those who do not agree with me and must honor each as a child of God. I will guard my lips, my mind, and my heart so that my language will not disparage, injure, or wound another child of God. I must do no harm, even while I see a common good. This morning's gospel reading, I believe, begs us to take a closer look this morning at doing no harm. We can all probably agree that doing no harm is a good thing. But it doesn't grab our attention like confrontation and discord does. Let me give you an example. I read not too long ago about a group of theologians and novelists and some others who were discussing the Bible's first book, Genesis. And when they got to the Cain and Abel story, they all agreed that Cain was the bad guy. But they also said that from the story angle, he was the more interesting character. Abel, who does all the right things, is approved by God, didn't generate nearly as much interest or discussion as Cain did. One of the folks even said that without Cain, there wouldn't have been the conflict necessary for creating a good story. You see, that's the problem with not doing harm. It's not something active like doing harm, or even like doing good. In many circumstances, folks, not making matters worse is the right thing, but it's hard to generate any enthusiasm about it. But when has the excitement quotient been the primary measure of how we should serve God? We may recognize first do no harm as a primary tenet of the medical world, which we understand is a basic principle of healthcare, do no harm. But it also belongs to the world of religion. In 1739, a small group of people approached John Wesley asking for his guidance in living spiritually upright lives. And he organized them into a group to meet weekly for the purpose of spiritual growth and moral examination. And he gave them three general rules to guide their behavior. The second and the third were respectively do good and practice the spiritual disciplines, or as Wesley said, attend to the ordinances of God. Or as Job in his book said, stay in love with God. These two might well have been expected advice for spiritual development. But before mentioning these, Wesley stated his first principle. And he said, "It is therefore expected of all who continue in the group meeting that they should continue to evidence their desire for salvation. First, by doing no harm, by avoiding evil of every kind." That's bedrock Christian behavior. As Jesus comments about turning the other cheek and giving their cloak and going the second mile suggests. And in the Sermon on the Mount, it's not the Sermon on the Mount isn't the only place in the New Testament where do no harm he suffered, he did not threaten. So you see, doing no harm isn't something that Jesus just talked about. It's something he also practiced. Leviticus 19 was also a part of our reading from the lectionary for this week. And most of Leviticus 19 is about doing no harm. Do not steal. Do not deal falsely. Do not lie. Do not defraud your workers. Do not create problems for the handicapped. Do not render false judgments. Do not slander. Do not take vengeance. In fact, it is only after this list of how to avoid doing harm that God gives them a command about something to do. After that list, then he says, love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, part of loving your neighbor is doing no harm. Almost every day, without exception, almost every day, we're in situations or problems, and we have no idea how to make them better. And in some of these situations and problems, there isn't any way for us to make them better. But we're pretty clear on how not to make them worse. How do we not make situations worse than they already are? That you do not keep from making a situation worse. First, you do not tell tales or spread rumors. Second, you don't blame others for your screw-ups. Third, you do not bore people to death by going on and on about your problems. Next, you don't vent your anger on people who aren't involved in your situation. After that, you do not disparage others to make yourself look good. And finally, you don't bear false witness. In other words, you do no harm, period. And starting from that position of doing no harm, from a position of doing no harm, starting from that position, is related to the spiritual discipline of submission. Now, submission is something that we don't hear much about in our culture today. Submitting to others, submitting to someone else. But submission is a spirit with which we view others, in which we relate to and treat them. It's a willingness to not get your own way. Well, that's strange. The willingness to not get your own way. And the ability to lay down the burden of not needing to come out on top. In some situations, submission is the freedom to just drop the matter. Just drop the matter. Makes me think of something Donna told me a long time ago when I was dealing with a lot of conflict. And my wife told me one day, she said, just because someone tosses you the ball doesn't mean you have to catch it. Just because someone tosses you the ball doesn't mean you have to catch it. Doesn't mean you have to get involved. Submission, it's the willingness not to get your own way, the ability to lay down that burden of not needing to come out on top. And in some situations, submission is the freedom author in his well-known book about the spiritual discipline says this: usually the best way to handle most matters of submission is to say nothing. Say nothing. Which he says is the kind of grace that sets others free. And he also says that submission, which puts aside our own needs to be the center of attention, frees us actually to get the value of the people. But submission has its limits. When it becomes destructive, not to take positive action, that active love for one's neighbors needs to take over. I found myself in that situation about 4 or 5 years ago. I found myself in that situation. I knew that whatever I did was going to cause harm. But I had to decide whether this situation, if I didn't address it, was going to cause more harm than my intervening would create. Sometimes things become destructive, and then you have to take action. Even in the world of medicine, with its do no harm ethic, there's a point where that must be put aside. You know, the goal of cancer treatment does not necessarily encompass do no harm as its guiding principle. I had a young man, it's been about almost 20 years ago now. His name was Tom. Tom was 32 years old, and he'd just been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which is a childhood leukemia. And Tom was going to die. And he had to make a choice whether to go through a bone marrow transplant or not. And he chose at first not to do that. Why? Because Tom had been laid off from the coal mines. He'd been laid off long enough that he no longer had insurance. Help was found for Tom financially, and Tom chose to go ahead and have a bone marrow transplant. I don't know whether you've known anyone who's had to go through that. But I walked beside Tom and Janice for a long time in that. And Tom had the bone marrow transplant done at Ruby. They gave him high-dose radiation for a day and a half. The radiation was so high that it actually burned his skin. His skin peeled off like he had a real bad sunburn. And then after they did that, they gave him a day and a half of a very intensive chemotherapy. I saw, not these little bags, I saw gallon bags of chemo hanging on the stand beside his bed for a day and a half. They pumped him full of those toxic chemicals. They saved Tom's life, but they did harm in doing it. It wasn't too long after Tom got out of the hospital that he had cataracts. It wasn't too long after that Tom began to tremble and shake because of some of the damage that the radiation did to his brain. And he still continues to struggle even today with the side effects of the chemo and radiation. But there was intervention that had to be done if Tom was choosing to live. Some of that intervention did some harm. But in our daily lives, however, most of our situations aren't cancerous or even extremely evil, but rather are differences of opinion or really somebody's self-centeredness or hang-ups that are shown. And often the way we deal with that person is by doing no harm. And so at the risk of repeating, that doing no harm may sometimes take the form of saying nothing. It may take the form of not passing along gossip. It may take the form of giving the other person some room to work things out. Sometimes that's all it's needed. Just back off and give someone a little space. They'll work it out. It sometimes takes the form of compromise and seeking the common good. And it almost always requires our thinking about what doing no harm means in that particular situation. And practicing what we've concluded. Earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, which this passage is taken from, Jesus told his audience, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven." Pharisees were known for their fastidious and zealous keeping of the law of Moses. This statement stunned the people who were listening to Jesus. It had to. Unless their righteousness exceeded that of the Pharisees, they won't enter the kingdom of heaven. Heck, they couldn't even come close to matching the righteousness of the Pharisees, let alone exceeding it. But then Jesus explains. He says it's not enough, for example, not to murder someone. The Pharisees abstained from murder, but they could also not hate others. Do that, and they exceeded the righteousness of the Pharisees. The problem was that the Pharisees were settling for keeping the letter of the law rather than the spirit of it. To exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, his hearers only needed to actively live the Scriptures. And in the examples from our text, actively living the Scriptures meant that doing no harm exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees. Instead of hitting back, turn the other cheek. Boy, it's hard, isn't it? But sometimes, man, we want to get our pound of flesh. Someone hurts me, I'm going to hurt them back. And I'm going to just hurt them back. I'm going to hurt them back twice as bad as they hurt me. Harm. Instead of making a big fuss about being forced to go to 1 mile, volunteer to go the second. Instead of seeking to hurt our enemies, pray for them. Intentionally doing no harm is a vital practice in living a holy life. It's a way of loving our neighbor. And Jesus gives us examples of how that's done. Turning the other cheek, loving the enemy, and so on. And models it in his own life. Returning good for evil. This is the way people behave in God's world. Do they behave like that in your world? Do they turn the other cheek? Do they go the extra mile? Do they pray for their enemies? People behave like that in your world? They don't always behave like that in my world, and I don't always behave like that. There's times when I fall short of the kingdom of God, just as you do. There do come times when we are dealing with a cancerous thing, or we must hasten to help. But some of the time, at a minimum, not making matters worse is the Christian thing to do. For the most part, I've learned in 46 years of marriage when to keep my mouth shut.